Before we begin, I need you to understand something. This isn't a story about science. This isn't even a story about war, not really. This is a story about what happens when human beings decide that other human beings are no longer human at all. About what happens when doctors become executioners, when laboratories become slaughterhouses, when the pursuit of knowledge becomes an excuse for the unspeakable. What you're about to hear destroyed more than 3,000 lives inside the walls of a single facility. It killed perhaps 200,000 more across the countryside of China. It reshaped the relationship between nations. It corrupted the foundations of medical ethics. It created a conspiracy of silence that lasted generations. And perhaps most troubling of all, it revealed something fundamental about human nature that we would all prefer to ignore. That under the right circumstances, with the right justifications, ordinary people can commit extraordinary evil. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. We're all part of this conversation, trying to understand how history's darkest chapters unfolded and what they mean for us today. Phone away, distractions silenced. Let's begin. In the beginning, long before laboratories and microscopes, long before anyone understood what disease truly was, human beings weaponized pestilence. Our story begins not in the 20th century, but thousands of years earlier, when ancient armies first recognized that death could spread from body to body like fire through dry grass. The Hittites, in the 14th century before Christ, may have produced the first documented example of biological warfare. They sent diseased rams, possibly infected with tularemia, to their enemies to weaken them before battle. The animals appeared as gifts, as tribute, but they carried invisible weapons that would devastate opposing forces more effectively than any bronze sword. During the siege of Kaffa in 1346, Mongol forces catapulted plague-infected corpses over the city walls. The defenders watched bodies arc through the sky and crash into their streets, and within weeks the Black Death was spreading through the fortress. Some historians believe this siege helped spread the plague throughout Europe, killing perhaps half the continent's population. Medieval warfare made frequent use of corpses and excrement. Armies would fling infected bodies over castle walls using catapults and trebuchets. They would contaminate wells with diseased animal carcasses, knowing that a poisoned water supply could destroy a besieged city more surely than any assault. They understood in their limited way that disease could be directed. That sickness could serve strategy. By the Renaissance, the concept had evolved. Military commanders during the American Revolutionary War discussed using smallpox-infected blankets. During World War I, Germany experimented with infecting livestock destined for Allied forces with glanders and anthrax, both known to devastate populations of grazing animals in natural epidemics. But these attempts remained crude, limited by an incomplete understanding of how disease actually worked. They were throwing stones in the dark, hoping to hit something vital. Then came the revolution in microbiology. The late 19th century witnessed an explosion of knowledge about the invisible world. Louis Pasteur proved the germ theory of disease in the 1860s. Robert Koch identified the bacteria responsible for anthrax, tuberculosis, and cholera. Scientists could suddenly see what had always been invisible, could culture what had been uncatchable, could preserve what had been fleeting. Disease became less mysterious and more mechanical. And if something is mechanical, it can be engineered. The first chapter of our story takes us to Japan at the turn of the 20th century, to a nation transforming itself with desperate velocity. The Meiji Restoration, which began in 1868, had opened Japan to Western influence after more than 200 years of isolation. The country's leaders understood that modernization meant survival, that without Western technology, Western military might, Western scientific knowledge, Japan would become another colony, another footnote in the story of European imperialism. So Japan modernized. Factories rose, railroads spread, Universities opened, teaching Western science in place of traditional learning. The military, in particular, underwent radical transformation. Where samurai had once fought with swords, modern soldiers now trained with rifles and artillery. Where strategy had once focused on honor and individual combat, modern warfare emphasized industrial efficiency and mass destruction. Japan was learning to fight like a Western power and learning quickly. By the early 20th century, Japan had proven itself. The nation shocked the world by defeating Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, the first time an Asian power had defeated a European one in modern warfare. Suddenly, Japan was a player on the world stage, a rising empire with ambitions across East Asia. The victory reinforced a growing militarism within Japanese society, a belief that military might could secure Japan's future, that conquest could solve the nation's problems with limited resources and growing population. Into this environment came a young man named Shiro Ishii. Born on June 25, 1892 in Shibayama Village, Chiba Prefecture, Ishii grew up in a Japan transforming before his eyes. His family was relatively prosperous by rural standards. He was bright, ambitious, and driven. He studied at the prestigious Kyoto Imperial University, where he earned a degree in medicine. But medicine for Ishii was never about healing. It was about power, about understanding systems that could be manipulated, about finding leverage over life itself. After graduating, Ishii joined the Imperial Japanese Army as a medical officer. He rose steadily through the ranks, becoming an instructor at the Imperial Japanese Army Medical School. He was charismatic in a peculiar way, able to convince his superiors of his vision, able to gather followers who would execute his plans without question. And his vision was clear. Japan needed biological weapons, not as a defensive measure, but as an offensive tool that could devastate enemy populations while preserving Japanese forces. A weapon that could kill millions while costing relatively little to produce. Ishii traveled to Europe in the 1920s, officially to study at various universities, unofficially to investigate Western military technology. He visited laboratories. He attended conferences. He studied the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which prohibited the use of chemical and biological weapons in warfare. And from this prohibition, Ishii drew a perverse conclusion. If so many nations felt compelled to ban such weapons, they must be extraordinarily effective. The very existence of the treaty proved the power of what it forbade. He returned to Japan in 1930 with proposals, detailed plans for a biological warfare research program, arguments about why Japan needed such a program, framed in terms of national security and military necessity. He convinced his superiors that other nations were already pursuing similar research, that Japan would fall behind if it didn't commit resources to this new form of warfare. Whether this was true or not hardly mattered. The argument worked. Fear of being left behind, of being vulnerable, opened doors and unlocked budgets. In 1932, the Japanese Army established the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department in Manchuria, the region of China that Japan had invaded the previous year. The name was deliberately innocuous, designed to suggest humanitarian work. In reality, this was the beginning of what would become Unit 731, though it would go through several reorganizations and name changes before assuming its final designation in 1936. Manchuria was perfect for Ishii's purposes. It was far from Tokyo, away from civilian oversight. It was occupied territory where Japanese military authority was absolute. The local population, Chinese civilians suspected of resistance, could be arrested by the Kempeitai, the military police, and delivered to the facility without trial or documentation. They would simply disappear into buildings that, from the outside, looked like factories or water treatment plants. The first facility was established near Bayan, south of Harbin in northern Manchuria. But in 1935, an incident occurred. Prisoners rioted and escaped. Details remained scarce, but the facility was compromised. Rather than abandon the program, Ishii convinced his superiors to expand it, to build something larger, more sophisticated, more secure. So construction began on a new facility in Pingfang, a suburb of Harbin. This would be Unit 731's permanent home, and it would grow into something unprecedented in human history. The complex eventually covered 6 square kilometers. Over 150 buildings rose across the site, administrative offices, barracks for the 3,000 staff members, laboratories equipped with the most advanced equipment available, greenhouses for cultivating pathogens, an airfield for testing biological bombs, barracks that looked like warehouses but were actually prisons with cells designed to hold test subjects. The prisoners, Ishii and his staff called them maruda, logs, lumber. The word stripped away humanity, made it easier to do what they planned to do. If someone is a log, you're not experimenting on a person. You're not committing murder. You're just processing materials. It was the first step in a linguistic transformation that would allow hundreds of educated medical professionals to participate in what would happen next. But then, something changed. What began as a covert research program evolved into something far more systematic. The world, meanwhile, was sliding toward war, and Japan's ambitions in Asia grew more aggressive with each passing year. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China. The Second Sino-Japanese War had begun, and it would merge into World War II, becoming one continuous conflict that would last until 1945. As the war expanded, so did Unit 731's operations. More facilities opened. Unit 100 focused on agricultural biological warfare, developing ways to infect livestock and crops. Unit 516 conducted chemical weapons research. Branch facilities appeared across occupied China and Manchuria. The program was metastasizing. By 1939, Unit 731 employed approximately 3,000 people, doctors trained at Japan's finest universities, nurses, technicians, support staff who maintained the buildings and prepared the equipment, guards who delivered the prisoners and disposed of the bodies. And at the center of it all stood Shiro Ishii, now a lieutenant general, the undisputed authority over Japan's biological warfare program. The experiments that took place within those walls defy easy description. Not because the details are unclear, but because they reveal capabilities for cruelty that most people would prefer not to believe exist. The physicians of Unit 731 conducted vivisections without anesthesia, cutting open living human beings to observe how organs function under various conditions. They wanted to understand shock, blood loss, pain tolerance. They needed to see these processes in real time, and anesthesia would have altered the results. So prisoners were strapped to tables, fully conscious, and dissected like laboratory animals. Their screams could be heard throughout the facility. Frostbite experiments took place regularly. Manchuria's winters were brutally cold, and Ishii wanted to develop effective treatments for Japanese soldiers suffering from cold injuries. So prisoners were taken outside in sub-zero temperatures. Their arms or legs were exposed to frigid air or plunged into barrels of ice water. Guards would strike the frozen limbs with sticks to test how solid they had become. Then the prisoners were taken inside and various rewarming techniques were tested. Hot water, gradual warming, different medical treatments. The prisoners' limbs would thaw and the flesh would rot, and the researchers would document every stage of the process. Some prisoners survived multiple rounds of freezing and thawing, their limbs destroyed incrementally, each experiment providing new data. Infection experiments formed the core of Unit 731's work. Prisoners were injected with bubonic plague, cholera, anthrax, typhus, syphilis, and dozens of other diseases. Sometimes the infections were introduced through contaminated food or water, sometimes through aerosol exposure, forcing prisoners to breathe air laden with pathogens. The researchers wanted to understand infection rates, incubation periods, symptom progression, and mortality rates. They wanted to know which diseases would be most effective as weapons, which would spread most readily, which would cause the most suffering before death. So they infected prisoners and observed what happened, documenting symptoms with clinical precision. When prisoners died, which they always did eventually, their bodies were autopsied immediately. The researchers wanted fresh tissue samples, organs that hadn't begun to decompose. They needed to see exactly how the disease had destroyed the body, which systems had failed first, what microscopic damage had occurred. The corpses were dissected thoroughly, samples preserved, data recorded. Then the remains were burned in the facility's crematorium. No graves, no markers, no acknowledgement that these people had existed. Pressure experiments tested human tolerance to extreme conditions. Prisoners were placed in sealed chambers where air pressure was rapidly increased or decreased. The researchers wanted to understand what would happen to pilots at high altitude or to submarine crews experiencing pressure changes. So they subjected prisoners to conditions that caused organs to rupture, blood vessels to burst, eyes to hemorrhage. They documented everything. The exact pressure at which various failures occurred, the sequence of symptoms, the time until death. Weapon testing required live targets. Unit 731 developed bombs designed to disperse plague-infected fleas. These bombs had porcelain casings that would shatter on impact without generating heat that might kill the fleas. The casings were filled with plague-infected flea colonies cultivated in the laboratory, and then the bombs were tested. Sometimes on prisoners tied to stakes in a testing field. Sometimes by aerial drops on Chinese villages where the population had no idea they were about to become test subjects. The researchers would then observe how the plague spread through the community, documenting infection rates and mortality patterns. The facility could produce enormous quantities of biological material. At its peak, Unit 731's laboratories could manufacture 300 kilograms of plague bacteria per month, 500 to 700 kilograms of anthrax, vast quantities of cholera, typhoid, and other pathogens. These weren't small batch experiments. This was industrial-scale production of weaponized disease, enough to devastate entire regions. Moving into the early 1940s, Unit 731's work became more ambitious. They weren't content with laboratory research anymore. They wanted field data, real-world results, and so they launched biological warfare attacks against civilian populations in China. In 1940, they dropped plague-infected fleas on the city of Ningbo. Plague broke out almost immediately. Hundreds died. The following year, they launched similar attacks on Changte, dropping infected wheat and rice grains over the city. An epidemic swept through the population, claiming countless lives. The researchers observed from a distance, documenting how the disease spread, how quickly it killed, how effective their weapons proved in actual combat conditions. These weren't military targets. These were civilian populations, villages, towns, cities. Places where people were living ordinary lives until disease fell from the sky. Farmers and shopkeepers and children, suddenly infected with plague or cholera or anthrax, dying in agony while Japanese researchers recorded data from nearby observation posts. Between 1936 and 1945, at least 3,000 people died inside Unit 731's facilities from the experiments themselves. But the actual death toll from the entire biological warfare program may have reached 200,000 or more. Many died in the facility branches. Many more died in field tests and deliberate attacks on civilian populations. The precise number will never be known because the records were incomplete, because many deaths were never documented, because entire communities were wiped out and no one remained to report what had happened. The second chapter reveals something crucial about who these victims were. The majority were Chinese civilians accused of being resistance fighters or spies. The Kempeitai would arrest anyone suspected of opposing Japanese occupation, and these prisoners would be delivered to Unit 731. But there were also Russian prisoners of war, Mongolians, Koreans, and others caught in the machinery of Japanese military expansion. Some accounts mention women and children among the experimental subjects. Pregnant women were infected to study how diseases affected fetuses. Children were subjected to the same experiments as adults because researchers wanted data across all age groups. The physicians who conducted these experiments were not sadists or madmen, not in the conventional sense. They were educated professionals. Many had trained at Kyoto Imperial University or other prestigious institutions. They had families. They wrote letters home. They celebrated holidays. They were ordinary people who had convinced themselves that what they were doing served a greater good. That Japanese soldiers' lives justified any number of Chinese deaths. That scientific knowledge excused any method of obtaining it. That the prisoners were somehow less than human, or that war made normal ethical considerations irrelevant. Cognitive dissonance allowed this to continue. The physicians could not acknowledge what they were actually doing without confronting their own monstrosity, so they developed elaborate justifications. The work was necessary for national defense. Other countries were pursuing similar research. The prisoners were criminals who deserved their fate. The data being collected would save Japanese lives. These rationalizations became mantras, repeated until they felt true, until they replaced whatever moral instincts might have once questioned the work. By 1943, the war was turning against Japan. The United States had entered the conflict. Allied forces were pushing back across the Pacific. The Japanese military was suffering defeats on multiple fronts. But Unit 731 continued its work, even as the broader war effort faltered. The program had its own momentum, its own logic. The experiments continued because they had always continued, because stopping would mean acknowledging that all the previous suffering had been meaningless. What happened next would shock the world, though the world wouldn't fully understand for decades. In August 1945, everything accelerated. The United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6 and August 9. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria on August 9. Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15. The war was over, but for Unit 731, the end of the war meant the beginning of a desperate cover-up. Shiro Ishii received orders to destroy all evidence of the program's activities. Everything had to disappear. Every document, every piece of equipment, every trace of what had occurred. The staff set about their task systematically, with the same cold efficiency they had applied to the experiments. They burned documents. They destroyed equipment. They dismantled the laboratories. They killed the remaining prisoners, hundreds of test subjects who might have provided testimony about what had happened. Some prisoners were poisoned. Some were shot. Some were locked in buildings that were then set on fire. A 14-year-old orderly named Hideo Shimizu was ordered to collect bones from the incineration rooms, bones from the Maruta whose bodies had been burned after being dissected or experimented upon. He would remember that task for the rest of his life. The main buildings were dynamited. The facility that had been the heart of Japan's biological warfare program was reduced to rubble. When Soviet forces arrived days later, they found ruins. They captured some lower-level personnel and conducted their own investigations, but the leadership had already fled. Ishii and most of the senior researchers escaped back to Japan before Soviet troops could arrest them. And then something remarkable happened, something that shaped the post-war order in ways that still resonate today. As Allied forces occupied Japan, they began investigating war crimes. The Tokyo trials prosecuted major war criminals, resulting in executions and prison sentences for those responsible for atrocities across Asia. But Unit 731 went unmentioned. The senior leadership was not arrested. They were not charged. They were not tried. Why? Because the United States made a deal. American military intelligence officers, particularly those from Camp Detrick, which would later become Fort Detrick, the heart of America's own biological warfare program, interviewed Unit 731 researchers extensively. They wanted the data. They wanted to know what 8 years of unrestricted human experimentation had revealed, because such data could never be obtained ethically in American laboratories. The human knowledge about biological weapons that Unit 731 had accumulated represented information that would otherwise require decades to develop. So the United States offered immunity to Ishii and most of his senior staff in exchange for complete disclosure of their research findings. The deal was secret. The occupation authorities classified all information about Unit 731's activities. American scientists traveled to Japan and conducted lengthy debriefings with the program's leadership. They received detailed reports about plague dispersal, anthrax infections, frostbite treatments, and countless other subjects. The data was shipped back to the United States and incorporated into American biological warfare research. Neither Shiro Ishii nor any of his senior staff faced trial at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. The immunity deal protected them. The Soviet Union later conducted its own trials, prosecuting some lower-level personnel who had been captured in Manchuria, but the leadership remained untouchable under American protection. The political calculus was simple, though morally catastrophic. The United States was entering the Cold War. Biological warfare research seemed important for national security, and if providing immunity to mass murderers was the price for obtaining data that might help America compete with the Soviet Union, then that price would be paid. Shiro Ishii lived quietly in Japan after the war. He died of throat cancer in 1959 at the age of 67, never having faced criminal prosecution. Many of his colleagues went on to distinguished careers. Some became university professors. Some opened private medical practices. Some took positions in Japan's post-war pharmaceutical industry. The technical expertise they had developed through mass murder proved quite marketable in civilian life. The cover-up was thorough but not perfect. Rumors circulated. Survivors told stories, though few believed them. Chinese authorities documented atrocities, but in the Cold War environment, Communist Chinese accusations carried little weight with Western audiences. The full story remained hidden, classified by both American and Japanese governments who had their own reasons for keeping Unit 731's history secret. The third chapter of this story takes us into the crisis of memory and justice. What happens when crimes of this magnitude are deliberately buried? What happens when governments choose to protect perpetrators rather than pursue accountability? For decades, Unit 731 remained a classified subject. American military documents about the program were locked away. Japanese government records were suppressed or destroyed. The very people who knew what had happened, both the researchers and the surviving victims, were either protected by immunity deals or dismissed as unreliable witnesses. The conspiracy of silence held because all the powerful parties had incentives to maintain it. But information has a way of emerging, slowly and incompletely, like water seeping through cracks. In the 1980s, Japanese investigative journalists began uncovering the story. Seiichi Morimura published a book called The Devil's Gluttony in 1981, a detailed exposé of Unit 731 based on interviews with former staff members and victims. The book became a bestseller in Japan and was translated into multiple languages. It sparked public interest and demanded official acknowledgement. Survivors came forward with testimonies. Chinese victims who had been subjected to biological warfare attacks, researchers' families who had learned fragments of the truth, former low-level staff members who felt guilt about their participation. These testimonies were often fragmentary, traumatized, but they corroborated each other in disturbing ways. They painted a consistent picture of systematic atrocity. Chinese authorities increased pressure on Japan to acknowledge and apologize for Unit 731's activities. The Museum of Evidence of War Crimes by Japanese Army Unit 731 opened in Harbin in 1985, built on the site of the original facility. Visitors could see preserved ruins, recovered documents, and hear survivor testimonies. The museum became a site of memory, insisting that what happened there be remembered rather than forgotten. Legal battles followed. Chinese victims filed lawsuits in Japanese courts, seeking acknowledgement and compensation for suffering caused by biological warfare attacks. Most of these lawsuits failed. Japanese courts acknowledged that the attacks had occurred, but ruled that China had waived compensation claims under post-war treaties. The legal reasoning was technically sound but morally hollow. It provided no justice for people who had been deliberately infected with plague or watched their families die from diseases dropped from Japanese aircraft. In the United States, documents began to be declassified. The Japanese Imperial Government Disclosure Act of 1999, introduced by Senator Dianne Feinstein, aimed to make records related to Japanese war crimes more accessible. Researchers gained access to previously classified files about Unit 731 and the immunity deals that had protected its leadership. These documents confirmed what had been suspected, that the American government had knowingly shielded war criminals in order to obtain their research data. The revelation of the immunity deals created ethical crises in multiple fields. Bioethicists confronted the fact that some of what was known about human responses to biological agents came from experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics. Should such knowledge be used? Did using it taint all subsequent research? There were no easy answers. The data existed. It had been obtained through torture and murder. But if physicians refused to use it, did that somehow make the victims' suffering more meaningless? The scandal also raised questions about the foundations of post-war bioethics. The Nuremberg Code, established in 1947 following the Nazi doctors' trials, set out principles for ethical human experimentation: informed consent, the right to withdraw, risk proportionate to benefit. But the Nuremberg Code had focused on German atrocities while ignoring Japanese ones. The American government had been prosecuting Nazi doctors for human experimentation, while simultaneously granting immunity to Japanese researchers who had done virtually identical things. The hypocrisy was stark. As we approach the modern age, the 1990s and early 2000s brought renewed attention to these historical atrocities. The end of the Cold War changed diplomatic calculations. Documents that had been classified for national security reasons were gradually released. Academic historians produced detailed studies of Unit 731 based on newly accessible archives. The story could no longer be dismissed as propaganda or speculation. The evidence was overwhelming. In 1997, Japanese lawyer Konan Tsuchiya filed a lawsuit on behalf of 180 Chinese victims of Unit 731's biological warfare attacks. The case worked its way through Japanese courts for years. In 2002, the Tokyo District Court acknowledged that Unit 731 had conducted human experiments and biological warfare attacks, but dismissed the compensation claims. The plaintiffs appealed to the Tokyo High Court, which upheld the dismissal. In 2007, the Supreme Court of Japan refused to hear the case, effectively ending legal recourse for the victims. These legal defeats were devastating, but they served a purpose. They generated publicity. They forced official judicial acknowledgement of what had occurred, even if compensation was denied. They created a documented record, court proceedings that confirmed the historical facts and made denial more difficult. Educational efforts expanded. Textbook controversies erupted in Japan, with conservative groups opposing detailed coverage of wartime atrocities, while progressive educators insisted that students needed to understand their nation's history honestly. Some Japanese textbooks glossed over Unit 731 or omitted it entirely. Others provided detailed accounts, teaching students about the experiments, the biological warfare attacks, and the post-war cover-ups. The battle over historical memory played out in classrooms, in editorial pages, in political debates. Museums and memorials proliferated. Beyond the main museum in Harbin, smaller exhibitions appeared in China, Japan, and other countries. Documentary films presented survivor testimonies and historical evidence to broad audiences. The story was becoming part of public consciousness in a way it had never been while the events were classified. Hideo Shimizu, the former orderly who had been ordered to collect bones in the final days before Unit 731's destruction, became a key witness in his twilight years. In August 2024, at age 95, he returned to Harbin to visit the museum and provide testimony. He spoke publicly about what he had seen, about the prisoners he had glimpsed, about the bones he had collected. His testimony was particularly important because it came from a Japanese participant rather than a Chinese victim, making it harder for denialists to dismiss. But Shimizu also faced backlash in Japan. Right-wing nationalists accused him of betraying his country, of spreading lies to damage Japan's reputation. He received threats. His public appearances generated controversy. The tensions revealed how contested this history remained even 80 years after the events. Today, we still grapple with the legacy of Unit 731. The story continues to generate debate, scholarship, and diplomatic tension. In Japan, political conservatives often resist full acknowledgement of wartime atrocities, arguing that dwelling on the past damages national pride. Progressives counter that honest reckoning with history is essential for national maturity. The tension remains unresolved. In China, Unit 731 functions as a symbol of Japanese aggression and brutality during the war years. The museum in Harbin attracts hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, many of them Chinese citizens seeking to understand their nation's history. The site serves educational and political purposes simultaneously, teaching about historical atrocities while reinforcing contemporary narratives about Japanese militarism. In the United States, the story of Unit 731 complicates triumphalist narratives about World War II. Americans generally remember the war as a moral crusade, defeating fascism and rescuing victims. But the immunity deals for Unit 731 researchers reveal moral compromises that don't fit neatly into that narrative. They show American officials choosing strategic advantage over justice, protecting war criminals because their knowledge seemed useful. The current status of biological weapons is governed by the Biological Weapons Convention, which entered into force in 1975. It prohibits the development, production, and stockpiling of biological and toxin weapons. 184 nations have signed the convention, but verification remains difficult. There are no robust inspection mechanisms. Nations can claim to be conducting defensive research while potentially developing offensive capabilities. The specter of biological warfare continues to haunt international relations. Contemporary debates about bioethics frequently reference Unit 731 as a cautionary tale. Medical students learn about it as an example of what happens when physicians abandon ethical principles. Researchers studying the ethics of human subjects research cite it as a reason why informed consent and oversight mechanisms are essential. The atrocities serve as a permanent reminder of how badly medicine can go wrong when it becomes subordinate to military or political goals. Recent scholarship has revealed new details about the extent of Unit 731's operations. In 2025, newly released archives from Japan confirmed the scale of human experimentation, showing that the facility employed around 3,000 personnel at its peak and could hold up to 600 prisoners simultaneously. Documents revealed the industrial efficiency of the operation, the bureaucratic structures that managed the systematic murder of thousands. The global COVID-19 pandemic brought renewed attention to biological threats, though of natural rather than weaponized origin. Discussions about pandemic preparedness, laboratory safety, and gain-of-function research on dangerous pathogens often reference historical biological warfare programs as examples of risks that require careful regulation. Unit 731 appears in these discussions as evidence of what can happen when infectious disease research is conducted without adequate ethical oversight. Survivor testimonies continue to emerge occasionally, though fewer survivors remain as decades pass. Those who do speak often describe the psychological difficulty of carrying such memories. Many survivors lived in silence for years, unable to process what they had experienced, unable to find audiences who would believe them. Breaking that silence later in life, sharing the truth publicly, can be both liberating and re-traumatizing. The question of justice remains unresolved. No significant prosecutions ever occurred. The Tokyo trials excluded Unit 731 entirely. The Soviet Union tried a handful of low-level personnel captured in Manchuria, sentencing them to labor camp terms, but the leadership was protected by American immunity deals. Shiro Ishii and his senior staff never faced meaningful accountability for their crimes. They lived out their lives freely, some even prospering, while their victims remained largely anonymous, their suffering unacknowledged. Compensation claims have universally failed in courts, but the fight for acknowledgement continues through other means. Chinese advocacy groups continue to petition Japanese authorities for official apologies and memorial efforts. Japanese civil society organizations work to educate the public about Unit 731 and other wartime atrocities. International human rights groups cite the case as evidence for the importance of war crimes tribunals and international justice mechanisms. The philosophical questions raised by Unit 731 resonate beyond this specific case. How do ordinary people become capable of committing extraordinary evil? The researchers at Unit 731 were not born monsters. They were educated professionals who convinced themselves that what they were doing was justified. Understanding how this transformation occurs, how normal moral constraints can be suspended, is crucial for preventing similar atrocities in different contexts. The role of dehumanizing language appears central. The term Maruda, logs, stripped prisoners of humanity and made it psychologically easier to experiment on them. Once victims are redefined as objects rather than people, moral constraints weaken. This linguistic dehumanization appears in virtually every genocide and mass atrocity. It's a warning sign, a mechanism that enables violence by changing how perpetrators perceive their victims. The corruption of science and medicine by military objectives represents another lasting lesson. When research becomes subordinate to power, when knowledge serves domination rather than healing, when physicians prioritize state interest over patient welfare, terrible things become possible. The Hippocratic Oath's injunction to first, do no harm, was systematically violated by hundreds of doctors who instead inflicted maximum harm in service of military research goals. As night deepens and you drift closer to sleep, consider what this story reveals about human nature and institutional power. Unit 731 was not an aberration, not some unique evil disconnected from broader patterns. It emerged from specific conditions: militarism that prioritized national power over individual lives, scientific culture that valued data over ethics, imperialism that denied the humanity of subject peoples, secrecy that prevented external oversight, and most fundamentally, the human capacity to rationalize cruelty when it serves goals we've convinced ourselves are important. These conditions can recur. They're not unique to 1930s Japan. They can emerge wherever institutions become unaccountable, wherever some group of people is defined as less than human, wherever the pursuit of power or knowledge or security becomes an all-consuming goal that overrides moral constraints. The story of Unit 731 is a warning, a reminder of possibilities we must guard against. The victims deserve to be remembered as individuals, not statistics. Each of those 3,000 people who died inside the Pingfang facility had names, lives, families who grieved them. Each of the 200,000 who may have died from biological warfare attacks was a person with hopes and fears and routines, whose existence was cut short by weapons deployed against civilian populations. Their anonymity is part of the tragedy. Most victims' names are unknown. They're buried in mass graves or were cremated, their ashes scattered, leaving no markers, no monuments, nothing to preserve their memory except the few testimonies that survived. Some names we do know. A Chinese man named Sheng Jinjai survived a biological warfare attack on his village and testified about watching neighbors die from plague. A Russian prisoner of war named Nikolai Khabarovsk testified at the Soviet trial about being subjected to experiments. Hideo Shimizu continues to testify about what he witnessed as a teenage orderly. These individual voices matter. They personalize what could otherwise become abstraction, remind us that behind the statistics were real people who suffered real agony. The site of the original Unit 731 facility in Pingfang remains, partially preserved as a museum and memorial. Visitors can walk through ruins of some buildings, see remnants of the prison cells where Maruta were held, view preserved equipment used in the experiments. The preservation is incomplete, both because much was destroyed before Soviet forces arrived, and because Chinese and Japanese authorities have had different priorities regarding how much to preserve and how to present it. But enough remains to give visitors a visceral sense of the place, the scale of the operation, the systematic nature of what occurred there. Educational materials continue to evolve. Museum exhibits become more sophisticated, incorporating survivor video testimonies, documents, photographs, and artifacts. School curricula in various countries include lessons about Unit 731 as part of broader teaching about World War II and medical ethics. Academic research continues producing new scholarship, mining archives for previously unknown details, analyzing the program from different theoretical perspectives. International organizations dedicated to preventing genocide and crimes against humanity cite Unit 731 as a case study in their educational materials. The Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. mentions it in comparative exhibits about atrocities. Medical schools use it in bioethics courses. Military academies study it when teaching about the laws of war and prohibited weapons. The story has become part of the shared historical knowledge that shapes how we think about war crimes, human rights, and the ethics of research. But awareness remains uneven. Many people in Western countries know about Nazi concentration camps, but have never heard of Unit 731. The European theater of World War II receives vastly more attention in American and European education than the Pacific theater. And within coverage of the Pacific War, atrocities like Unit 731 are often minimized or omitted. This imbalance reflects various factors: geopolitical alliances during the Cold War, linguistic barriers, the classification of relevant documents for decades. But it means that public understanding of the full scope of World War II atrocities remains incomplete. The survivors who are still alive continue to age. Soon, there will be no one left who directly experienced what happened. The last witnesses will be gone. This makes documentation urgent. Historians and filmmakers work to record as many testimonies as possible while survivors remain. But once the last witness dies, the story will exist only in documents, photographs, and second-hand accounts. The living memory will be gone. What we choose to remember shapes who we become. Societies that honestly confront their histories, acknowledge their crimes, and learn from their mistakes tend to be healthier than those that bury uncomfortable truths. Japan's incomplete reckoning with Unit 731 and other wartime atrocities remains a source of tension with neighboring countries, particularly China and Korea. Political leaders who visit Yasukuni Shrine, where convicted war criminals are enshrined alongside other war dead, generate protests and diplomatic incidents. The unresolved historical questions continue to poison contemporary relationships. Full acknowledgement would require more than apologies. It would require incorporating these histories fully into national narratives, teaching them comprehensively in schools, creating prominent memorials, and finding some way to honor victims even when compensation is no longer possible. It would mean Japan fully confronting the implications of its imperial past, not as a source of shame that paralyses the nation, but as a historical reality that must be understood and learned from. The challenge is not unique to Japan. Every nation has chapters of its history that are difficult to face. The United States struggles with the legacies of slavery and genocide against indigenous peoples. European nations grapple with colonialism. Turkey disputes the Armenian genocide. China has its own historical blind spots regarding events like the Cultural Revolution. The human tendency is to minimize or rationalize one's own side's atrocities while emphasizing those of opponents. Breaking through this tendency requires moral courage and intellectual honesty. As sleep approaches, as your mind drifts toward dreams, the story of Unit 731 remains. It happened. The facts are documented. The evidence is overwhelming. And we are left to contemplate what it means, what it reveals about institutional structures that enable atrocity, about individual psychology that rationalizes cruelty, about the fragility of ethical norms when confronted with power and secrecy, about justice deferred or denied, about memory's importance in preventing repetition. The story continues because the underlying questions remain relevant. How do we prevent such things from happening again? How do we create institutional safeguards that can't be overridden when political or military leaders decide that moral constraints are inconvenient? How do we maintain ethical standards in medical research when pressures exist to cut corners or prioritize results over protections? How do we ensure that classified programs receive adequate oversight even when national security justifications are invoked? These aren't abstract questions. They apply to contemporary debates about torture, about gain-of-function research on dangerous pathogens, about surveillance technologies, about artificial intelligence developed for military purposes. The specific technologies change, but the fundamental tensions remain. Power seeks freedom from constraint. Security arguments are used to justify exceptions. Secrecy prevents accountability. And people, ordinary people with families and hobbies and moral beliefs, can convince themselves to participate in terrible things when the right combination of factors is present. Unit 731 stands as a permanent reminder that civilization is thinner than we'd like to believe. That education and professional training provide no immunity against moral failure. That the veneer of scientific objectivity can mask deliberate cruelty. That institutions, once created and given sufficient independence, can pursue their own logic even when that logic leads to horror. And that without transparency, accountability, and constant vigilance, such things can happen again. Before the end, before sleep takes you fully, remember the victims. Remember that 3,000 people, perhaps many more, died terrible deaths inside the walls of that facility. Remember the 200,000 who may have died from biological warfare attacks on civilian populations. Remember their suffering, their terror, their lost futures. They deserve memory. They deserve acknowledgement. They deserve justice, even if that justice will forever remain incomplete. Remember, too, the perpetrators, not to excuse them, but to understand how ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil. Shiro Ishii was not a demon. He was a physician who allowed ambition and ideology to corrupt his profession's most basic commitment. The 3,000 staff members who worked at Unit 731 were not monsters. They were people who convinced themselves that what they were doing was necessary, who accepted rationalizations, who followed orders, who didn't ask questions they should have asked. Understanding how this happens, how individual moral compasses can be so thoroughly corrupted, is essential for recognizing warning signs when similar dynamics begin to emerge. When we see dehumanizing language, when we see secrecy justified by national security, when we see ends justify means reasoning, when we see power concentrating without oversight. These are the conditions that made Unit 731 possible. Recognizing them gives us a chance to object, to resist, to insist on transparency and accountability before atrocities occur. The final thought, as night deepens and consciousness fades, is about responsibility. Those who knew about Unit 731 after the war and chose silence share responsibility for the perpetuation of injustice. American officials who granted immunity to war criminals in exchange for their data. Japanese authorities who suppressed documentation and opposed full disclosure. Individuals who knew fragments of the truth but stayed quiet. All contributed to the cover-up, to the decades of silence that denied victims acknowledgement and prevented society from learning necessary lessons. We have a responsibility too, those of us living now with access to information about what happened. We have a responsibility to remember, to ensure the story is told, to insist that such histories be taught, to oppose the forces that would minimize or deny atrocities because acknowledgement is inconvenient, to support survivors and their families seeking justice, to apply the lessons of history to contemporary challenges, recognizing warning signs, supporting accountability mechanisms, insisting on transparency. The story continues because we continue it. Through memory, through education, through the demands we make on our institutions and leaders, through refusing to accept that might makes right, that classified means unaccountable, that national interest justifies any crime, through maintaining that human dignity matters, that research subjects have rights, that physicians must heal rather than harm, that soldiers must distinguish combatants from civilians, that knowledge gained through torture is tainted. Unit 731 happened. That reality cannot be changed. But what we do with that knowledge, how we let it shape our understanding and our actions, remains within our control. The victims cannot be brought back. The atrocities cannot be undone. The years of silence and denial cannot be erased, but we can ensure the story is known. We can honor the victims by refusing to forget them. We can learn the lessons and apply them. We can insist on justice and accountability even when those things are difficult and uncomfortable. Let that be the thought that follows you into sleep. That bearing witness matters. That memory is resistance against those who would prefer convenient forgetting. That even when justice is incomplete, acknowledgement is important. That the victims of Unit 731, those whose names we know and those who remain anonymous, deserve to be remembered not as statistics but as people. As individuals who suffered, who died, who had lives stolen from them by a program that treated human beings as raw materials for research. The darkness deepens. The story settles into memory. Tomorrow, the work of remembering, of learning, of ensuring such things never happen again, continues. For now, rest with the knowledge that bearing witness to difficult histories, refusing to let atrocities be forgotten or minimized, is itself a form of resistance, an insistence that truth matters, that victims matter, that accountability matters, that we, the living, have obligations to the dead. The story of Unit 731 never truly ends. It echoes forward through time, a warning and a reminder challenging each generation to confront what human beings are capable of when institutions and ideologies strip away moral constraints. To remember, to understand, to ensure that knowledge shapes how we build the future, that the lessons purchased at such terrible cost are not lost. Sleep now. Let the weight of history settle gently. The story will be here in the morning, waiting to be told again, to be remembered again, to challenge and disturb and teach. As it must be, for as long as humans tell stories about who we are and what we're capable of and what we must guard against, the story continues, always.